Now, this is truly, truly unbelievable that we have narco terrorists south of the border, where they're now coming north of the southern border, coming into the United States. And we're going to see the kind of murder and mayhem that you see in parts of Mexico right here in our own country. We're losing 100,000 people a year to fentanyl. The only war in which we lost more people a year was the Civil War. Not even World War II. It was close, but I want you to think about that. We've lost 100,000 people a year, mostly young people, to this. Let's take a look at what Vice produced about a year ago. Vice is a left-wing site. That said, it does a pretty good job here on the deadliest cartel in Mexico, the war on drugs. Go.
Acapulco has become Mexico's murder capital due to a merciless drug war between gangs. Workers recover a dismembered body dumped in the middle of the afternoon.
The war on drugs in Mexico has become synonymous with grotesque acts of violence. Mass graves, dead bodies hung from bridges, decapitated heads left out on the street have all become increasingly normalized. The war on drugs throughout Latin America has always been deadly. But this kind of violence that seems undertaken almost for its own sake, really became a daily part of life in Mexico in the late 2000s. And it was largely an innovation of one particular cartel. The story of that cartel tells us something about how the war on drugs works in general. This is how Mexico's deadliest drug trafficking group rose and fell. This is the story of Los Zetas.
Los Zetas is a powerful and violent criminal syndicate in Mexico and is considered by the US government to be the most technologically advanced, sophisticated, and dangerous cartel in Mexico. They are most notoriously known as a drug cartel with an affinity for indiscriminate, brutal violence, torture, kidnapping, and slaughter.
The birth of the Zetas drug cartel can be traced back to at least January 1st, 1994, when the North American Free Trade Agreement between America, Canada, and Mexico came into effect. In protest at what they saw as capitalist neocolonialism, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation launched an armed rebellion in the southern Chiapas region of Mexico, bordering Guatemala. To fight the Zapatistas, the Mexican military invested heavily in their special forces. The US military, who like nothing more than training Latin American soldiers to fight socialist uprisings, gave these elite troops specialist training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
The United States had a school where it trained inside the United States many military officers from Latin America.
Ociel Cardenas, who headed the Gulf Cartel, recruited a group of deserters from the Mexican Special Forces to become his own private army, known as Los Zetas. The Zetas used their military efficiency to fundamentally change the game of the Mexican drug war.
So you had this drug trafficker, Ociel Cardenas, who rose to the top of the Gulf Cartel, and he recruited people from the special forces of the Mexican military. The first set that he recruited was Arturo Guzman de Sena. So what you saw was a change in the way drug cartels fought with violence. It was no longer those gang members with shaved heads and tattoos fighting with pistols and knives. It was militarized style, fighting like military units. And once they did it, this was spread across to every cartel in Mexico.
Suddenly, it was no longer about street gangs having wild shootouts. It was about disciplined, paramilitary units operating with massive firepower and extreme ruthlessness. The Zetas even created military-style medals to honor troops who fought particularly well.
So the Zetas really upped the ante of violence within their conflict and their use of terror. I think a lot of this comes from the fact they were from the military and they had this instruction of how you defeat insurgencies, this anti-insurgency training that had originated in the United States, and this idea that you control territories through the use of terror.
But at this point, even though the violence was growing, it was still somewhat contained within the drug trafficking underworld. The real problem started when the war on drugs got involved. Following the so-called kingpin strategy of trying to fight drug cartels by taking out their leaders, Mexican troops shot Guzman de Sena dead in 2002, hitting him with over 50 bullets. A few months later, Ociel Cardenas, the head of the Gulf Cartel, was arrested. While he was in prison in Mexico, Cardenas could still maintain control of both the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas. But when he was extradited to the US in 2007, things began to fall apart.
You had this small unit which grew and grew, that is the Zetas inside the Gulf Cartel, until eventually it was like a whole army within the Gulf Cartel that would rise up saying, we don't need you anymore, we're going to take this for ourselves, and then break away from the Gulf Cartel and form its own organization. And this erupting into open warfare in 2010 between the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel.
And this is when the real horror stories began to emerge. In August of 2010...
By the way, you notice the undercurrent that it's our fault? You notice the undercurrent, it's the United States' fault for trying to put an end to this early on. No, it's not. It is the failure of the Mexican government to be a government of law and order. That's why we have illegal immigration going on in this country. The corrupt parties in Mexico, particularly the ruling party that ruled there for like half a century or more. The corruption there is just enormous. It's unimaginable by American standards. So just keep that in mind. But the rest of this, I think, is quite interesting. Go ahead.
Entered a ranch in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, and discovered a mass grave containing the bodies of 72 people, 58 men and 14 women. These were immigrants from Central America who the Zetas had executed in a military style. In 2011, a further series of mass graves were discovered in San Fernando. This time, 193 bodies were recovered. People had been tortured and mutilated. Women had been raped. And reports came back that men had been forced to fight each other to the death with hammers and machetes, with the survivors being forcibly recruited as hitmen for the Zetas. In 2014, 2 men from the town of Allende were thought to have stolen money from the Zetas. So armed units came to Allende, destroyed 80 homes with heavy machinery, and murdered somewhere between 300 to 500 people.
They also prepare guisos. These are stews where you take a member of the family and you put them in a pig boiler and you pour gasoline on them and then you set a match to them.
When looking at atrocities like this, it's important to remember that they are a consequence of the drug war. The war on drugs always functions as an arms race. In an illegal market, the only way to win market share is through violence. So violence will inevitably increase, with each group trying to outdo the last until something like the Zetas emerges. And while it's the scale of their violence that caught most people's attention, what's probably most interesting about the Zetas is that they actually came up with a whole new business model for what a cartel could be. While traditional cartels always focused on trade routes for narcotics into the US, the Zetas, perhaps based on their military background, would move into areas, then try to literally hold that territory like an invading army. The Zetas became more than just drug traffickers. They diversified, taking over entire black market industries through extreme violence and making huge profits.
They'd also take over the local drug selling, shaking down, kidnapping, stealing cars, selling pirated goods. They started taking over corrupt trade unions. So it wasn't just a fight about the drug trade of the United States. It was a fight about controlling every inch of territory and all of the businesses in this territory.
When a legitimate casino in Monterrey refused to pay protection money, Zeta soldiers arrived in broad daylight, doused the entrances in gasoline, and set the building on fire, killing 52 civilians. They openly challenged the Mexican government and military, claiming with some justification that they were the real power in the territories under their control. The Zetas eventually became so powerful that they began an audacious, sustained, and incredibly profitable attack on Mexico's national oil company, Pemex.
It's the Zetas are the primary thieves. They are making a great deal of money from the oil industry.
So we're out on patrol with the Mexican Army right now. We're going to go to a Pemex pipeline that we think got broken into yesterday. And as we're driving, we have a walkie-talkie that's tapped into the frequency of the cartels who are talking about us.
El personal militar se le llama 80s. Policía Federal, bandas.
Ahí con las 380 y el panda nos metimos por la calle de 10.
The DEA identified the Zetas as the most aggressive and technologically advanced Mexican organized crime group, but then it all came crashing down. So, what happened? How How did the Zetas fall from power almost as quickly as they had risen? Part of the answer lies in the classic pattern of those fighting the war on drugs, trying to fix one problem and creating even worse ones in the process. In October of 2012, the Mexican Navy shot and killed the Zetas commander Heriberto Lezcano. Control of the Zetas then passed to Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales. Trevino was the first Zetas commander who didn't come from a military background. He was a drug trafficker who'd risen through the ranks through sheer brutality and ruthlessness. But this marked a shift in the Zetas as a whole. They'd expanded so rapidly that they'd had to fill out their ranks with random street thugs and gangsters, losing the military unity and discipline that had set them apart in the first place. And as discipline broke down, one faction began fighting another. None of this made the violence any less intense. The drugs kept flowing, and civilians kept getting kidnapped, extorted, and caught in the crossfire. As so often when the authorities take out a central leadership figure, the violence actually got worse, with the murder rate in Mexico steadily climbing over the past few years. But what really killed the Zetas was the war on drugs itself. As profitable as extortion, kidnapping, and oil theft can be, nothing can really compete with the drug trade in terms of criminal profits. And the established organized crime groups like the Sinaloa cartel simply had more established drug trafficking networks and deeper international connections. As successful as they'd been at first, over the long term, with authorities continually targeting those at the top, the Zetas simply couldn't compete with the established traffickers. And very simply, the other cartels just started copying the Zetas' own practices of ultra-violence and narco-terrorism and turned it back on them. The Zetas methods and firepower have now been replicated by the older cartels and by newer groups like the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who started life as Mata Zetas, but now operate with similar paramilitary ruthlessness. This is how the drug war works. Once one cartel has started chopping off people's heads and burning them alive, the others have to follow and go even more extreme. The arms race only ever goes one way, towards more and more intense violence. Last year, even as COVID forced people to stay home, over 35,000 people were murdered in Mexico. And cocaine, meth, heroin, and weed continued to make billions of dollars for the murderers.
So hearing all this, and this was broadcast on this little left-wing network, May 31, 2021. And I think they did a very good job overall. And they're courageous. They're showing their faces. How do you justify an open border? How do you justify people coming into this country illegally and we don't know who they are and where they're going? Knowing all of this, which the Biden administration knows this and a whole lot more, this is a massive failure.
Want to see more? Sign up for Levin TV.